way, starting at 124. Poor Giotto's Charity, as Swann called her, instructed by Francois to scrape them, would have them beside her in a basket. Her expression as mournful as though she were suffering all the misfortunes of the earth, and the light crows of azure that girded the asparagus stalks above her tunics of pink were delicately drawn, star by star, as in the fresco, are the flowers bound around the forehead or tucked into the basket of virtue at Perdot. And meanwhile Francois would be turning on the spit of one of those chickens, such as she alone knew how to roast, which had carried the fragrance of her merits through the far reaches of Cambrai, and which, while she was serving them to us at the table, would cause the quality of gentleness to predominate in my particular conception of her character, the aroma of that flesh which she knew how to render so unctuous and so tender, being for me only the specific perfume of one of her virtues. But the day on which, while my father consulted the family council about the encounter with Le Jardin, I went down to the kitchen, was one of those on which Giotto's Charity, very ill from her recent confinement, could not get out of bed. Francois, having no help now, was late. When I arrived downstairs, she was busy in the scullery that opened onto the poultry yard, killing a chicken which, by its desperate and quite natural resistance, but accompanied by Francois, beside herself as she tried to split its neck under the ear, with cries of vile creature, put the saintly gentleness and unction of our servant a little less in evidence than it would at the dinner the next day. By its skin embroidered with gold like chasuble, and its precious juice drained from a ciborium. When it was dead, Francois collected the blood, which flowed without drowning her resentment, had another fit of anger, and looked at her enemy's cadaver, said one last time, "Vile creature." I went back upstairs, trembling all over. I wanted them to dismiss Francois immediately, but who would have prepared me such cozy hot water baths, such fragrant coffee, and even those chickens? And in fact, everyone had to make this cowardly calculation, just as I had. For my Aunt Leonie knew, as I did not yet know, that Francois, who would for her daughter, for her nephews, have given her life without a murmur, was singularly hard-hearted towards other people. Despite this, my aunt had kept her, for if she was aware of her cruelty, she valued her service. I gradually came to see that the gentleness, the compunction, the virtues of Francois concealed scullery tragedies, just as history reveals that the reigns of the kings and the queens who are portrayed with their hands joined in church windows were marked by bloody incidents. I realized that, apart from her own relatives, human beings inspired her with more pity for their afflictions the further away from her life they lived. The torrents of tears she shed while reading in the newspaper about the misfortune of strangers would dry up quickly if she could picture to herself at all precisely the person concerned. On one of the nights following her confinement, the kitchen maid was seized by appalling cramps. Mamma heard her moaning, got up, and woke Francois, who, quite indifferent, declared that all this wailing was a sham, that the girl wanted to be the center of attention. The doctor, who had been afraid of this sort of attack, had put a marker in a medical book we had, at the page on which the symptoms are described, and told us to consult it in order to find out what kind of first aid to give. My mother sent Francois to get the book, warning her not to let the bookmark fall out. After an hour, Francois had not returned. My mother, indignant, thought she had gone back to bed and told me to go to the library myself and see. There I found Francois, who, having wanted to look at what the marker showed, was reading the clinical description of the attack and sobbing, now that the patient was a hypothetical one whom she did not know. At each painful symptom mentioned by the author of the article, she would explain, "Oh, dear Holy Virgin, is it possible that the good Lord would want a wretched human creature to suffer so? Oh, the poor girl." But as soon as I called her and she came to the bedside of Gioda's Charity, her tears immediately stopped flowing. She could recognize neither the pleasant sensation of pity and tenderness which she knew so well, and which reading the newspaper had so often given her, nor any kindred pleasure in the bother and irritation of having gotten up in the middle of the night for the kitchen maid, and at the sight of the same suffering whose description had made her cry. She now produced nothing more than bad-tempered mutterings, even nasty pieces of sarcasm, saying, when she thought we had gone and could no longer hear her, she had only to stop herself doing what you do to get this way. Sure, she enjoyed it well enough, so she needn't make a fuss now. Anyways, a boy must be quite forsaken by the good Lord to want to keep company with that. Ah, 'tis just as they used to say in my poor mother's own tongue, love a dog's arse, and to thy nose 'twill smell like a rose. Although when her grandson had a little cold in the head, she would set off at night even if she was ill instead of going to bed, to see if he needed anything, covering 4 leagues on foot before daybreak in order to be back in time to do her work. This same love of her own people and her desire to ensure the future greatness of her house was expressed in her policy towards other servants, by a consistent principle which was never to let one of them become attached to my aunt, whom she took, moreover, a sort of pride in not allowing to be approached by anyone, preferring, when she herself was ill, to get up out of bed in order to give her mistress her Vichy water, rather than permit the kitchen maid access to the bedroom. And like the hymenopteron observed by Fabre, the burrowing wasp, so that its young may have fresh meat to eat after its death, summons anatomy in aid of its cruelty, and, after capturing a few weevils and spiders, proceeds with a marvelous knowledge and skill to pierce them in the nerve center that governs the movement of their legs, but not their other life functions, in such a way that the paralyzed insect, near which it deposits its eggs, provides the larvae, when they hatch, with prey that is docile, harmless, incapable of flight or resistance, but not in the least tainted. Francois found, to serve her abiding desire to make the house intolerable to any other servant, ruses so clever, so merciless, that many years later we learned that if we had eaten asparagus almost every day that summer, it was because their smell provoked in the poor kitchen girl, who was given the job of scraping them, attacks of asthma so violent she was obliged to leave in the end. Alas, we had to change our minds definitively about Le Gendrine. On one of the Sundays following the meeting on the point of vue, after which my father had to confess himself mistaken, as Mass was ending and as something so far from holy was entering the church, with the sunlight and the noise from outdoors, that Madame Goupil and Mademoiselle Goupil and Mademoiselle Percepied, Madame's, not Mademoiselle's. All those people who had not long before, when I arrived a little late, had remained with their eyes absorbed in their prayers, and who I might have even believed had not seen me come in, if, at the same time, their feet had not been gently pushed back the little kneeling bench that was blocking my path to my seat, began to converse with us loudly about quite temporal subjects, as if we were already in the square. We saw on the blazing threshold of the porch, looking out over the motley tumult of the garden, Le Gendrine being introduced by the husband of that lady, with whom we had just recently encountered him, to the wife of another large landowner of the area. Gendrine's face expressed an animation and a zeal that were quite extraordinary. He made a deep bow with a secondary recoil that brought him back sharply up past its starting position, and that might have been taught him by the husband of his sister, Madame de Combrenier. This rapid straightening caused Le Grandin's bottom, which I had not supposed was so fleshy, to flow back in a sort of ardent muscular wave, and I do not know why that undulation of pure matter, that quite fleshy billow, with no expression of spirituality, and whipped into a storm by a fully contemptible alacrity, suddenly awakened in my mind the possibility of a Le Grandin quite different from the one we knew. This lady asked him to say something to her coachman, and as he went over to the carriage, the imprint of timid and devoted joy which the introduction had set upon his face persisted there. He was smiling, enraptured in a sort of dream. Then he hurried back to the lady, and since he was walking more quickly than was his habit, his two shoulders oscillated ridiculously right and left, and so entirely did he abandon himself to this, without concern for anything else, that he looked like the inert and mechanical plaything of happiness itself. Meanwhile, we were leaving the porch. We were going to pass right by him. He was too well-mannered to turn his head away, but he fastened his gaze, suddenly burdened by a profound reverie, on so distant a point of the horizon that he could not see us and did not have to greet us. His face remained ingenuous above his straight and supple jacket that looked as though it had been led astray against its will into detestably splendid surroundings. And a polka-dotted lavalier bow tie, tossed by the wind in the square, continued to float in front of the Gendrine like a flag of his proud isolation and noble independence. Just as we reached the house, Maman realized that Saint Honore cake had been forgotten, and asked my father to go back the way we had come, taking me with him, and tell them to bring it immediately. Near the church we met Le Grandin, who was coming in the opposite direction, escorting the same lady to her carriage. He passed close to us, did not break off his conversation with his neighbor, and from the corner of his blue eye gave us a little sign that in some way interior to his eyelid, and which, not involving the muscles of his face, could go perfectly unnoticed by the lady he was talking to, but seemed to compensate by intensity of feeling for the somewhat narrow field in which he had circumscribed its expression. In the other corner assigned to us, he set sparkling all the liveliness of a grace that exceeded playfulness, bordered on mischievousness. He over-refined the subtleties of amiability into winks of connivance, insinuations, innuendos, the mysteries of complicity, and finally exalted his assurances of friendship into protestations of affection, into a declaration of love, illuminating for us alone, at that moment, with a secret languor invisible to the lady, a love-smitten eye in the face of ice. He had, in fact, asked my parents the day before to send me to dine with him that evening. "Come and keep your old friend company," he had said to me, "like a bouquet sent to us by a traveler from a country to which we will never return. Allow me to breathe from the distance of your adolescence those flowers that belong to spring times, which I too traversed many times ago. Come with the primrose, the monk's beard, the buttercup. Come with the sedum that makes the bouquet of love in Balzac's Flora. Come with the flower of Resurrection Day, the Easter daisy, and the garden snowdrop, which is beginning to perfume your great aunt's paths, even though the last snows dropped by the Easter showers have not yet melted. Come with the glorious silk raiment of the lily worthy of Solomon himself, and with the polychrome enamel of the pansies, but above all, come with the breeze still cool from the last frosts, that will open the petals for the 2 butterflies that have waited at its door since morning, of the first Jerusalem rose." I'm going to stop there. It's a little short today. I is a 129.